Hello and welcome to our Climate Lit Fall Kickoff event. There are folks populating the room, so I'm going to give folks a little bit of time to log on and say welcome one more time. This event is being recorded, but if you are attending as an attendee, you will not be visible on the screen, but you will be able to view the recording at a later date. Again, welcome. This is Climate Lit's Fall 2022 Kickoff Event or Flash Scholarship Showcase. Thank you for being here and for watching. There's a lot of other things we could be doing on a Friday midday or afternoon or morning, and I'm grateful that y'all are here. My name is Nick Cleese, and I'm the Director of Outreach at the Center for Climate Literacy at the University of Minnesota and an editor at Climate Lit. I'm hosting this webinar from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, which is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of the Dakota people. We at Climate Lit understand our work toward climate literacy to not just be an issue about literacy, but also an issue of climate justice, educational justice, racial and social justice. And I am honored to facilitate a panel today made up of folks committed to that same mission. I'm excited to listen and to learn from them. For context, Climate Lit is the flagship initiative of the Center for Climate Literacy at the University of Minnesota. Climate Lit believes that climate literacy includes understandings of Earth systems, but it also includes story systems, particularly stories for young people, because these stories provide readers with formative and transformative experiences that become the foundation for an ecocentric life. Our mission is to provide educators with the resources they need to implement climate literacy education in their classroom. And part of this work involves hosting free virtual events such as this, which connect scholars, teacher educators, and educators themselves to host discussions and conversations to further our practice. And I am going to share my screen so that we all might be on the same page or same slide and be able to enjoy all of this content collectively. Here we go, slideshow. Our showcase today features 6 fantastic scholars, educators, and human beings. Each are going to have 5 minutes to share a little practical insight into their scholarship, a little amuse-bouche, before we gather for a more general discussion at the end. And our panelists today are going to include, and this is the order that we will see them in, Alex Panos, who's an assistant professor in literacy studies at the College of Education at the University of South Florida. Dr. Anja Höing, faculty in the Institute for English and American Studies at the University of Osnabrück, and co-editor of Humans and Animals, Intersecting Lives and Worlds. Dr. Antonio Lopez, professor of Communications and Media Studies at John Cabot University in Rome, and author of Eco-Media Literacy, Integrating Ecology into Media Education. Dr. Tanya Nathaniel, lecturer in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at San Jose State University, and co-editor of Global Children's Literature in the College Classroom. We also have Yinyu Chen, scholar and educator and founder of STEAM Mandarin, as well as Taiwanese American Learning Cooperative, otherwise known as TALK. We also have Alan Webb, professor of English at Western Michigan University and co-author of Teaching Climate Change to Adolescents, Reading, Writing, and Making a Difference. Thank you everyone for being here. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Alex. Alex, thank you so much for starting us off.
Thank you, Nick, for hosting this wonderful conversation. And thanks to everyone who's able to share space with us today. Like Nick mentioned, I am at the University of South Florida and I'm in Tampa Bay right now, which is the traditional home of the Tocobaga, Seminole, and Calusa people, as well as their ancestors going back over 10,000 years. And today, where I am is home to the Seminole, Miccosukee, Muskogee, and Choctaw. And I mentioned that as part of land acknowledgement, but also an acknowledgement that settler colonialism was enforced by the institutions of learning, where we're all sitting in different places around the world right now, and specifically through educational disciplines such as ours. And so I just take a moment to acknowledge that. So I wanted to talk today about something I've been thinking a lot about in the past few months, which is how distinct what doing work on climate literacy might look like depending on where we are on this living earth. And that can be for so many reasons, right? Place-based orientations to climate literacy are exceptionally important. They're not new. It is not something that is new to fields of eco-literacies, eco-media, eco-justice. It's part of the fabric of the work. But what's prompted me to think more about that is because here in Florida, as with other areas across the world and other areas across the United States, which is where I'm located, policies and laws are being enacted that directly impact teaching and learning and what's possible in classrooms, in particular in relationship to issues of justice and equity. So for example, here in Florida, the HB 7, colloquially known as the Stop Woke Act, is already impacting the books that are available for teachers, the curriculum that students have access to, and more generally, what teachers feel safe bringing into classrooms and what librarians feel safe stocking their shelves with. And so in the past, I've thought about climate justice literacy and how it prompts transdisciplinary questions and approaches, how it prompts explorations of the motivated and affective nature of complex issues like climate justice and the texts we create and engage with, and I mean text very broadly there, but that it's part of the work of narrative, part of the work of reading or citizenship in the world today, and that we really need a counter narration to address and document injustice, but also create visions for the future. And I've just been thinking a lot about how all of those sorts of ways of talking about climate justice literacy are directly impacted by where we are. And teachers that I'm working with now are talking about being afraid. Teachers that I'm working with now are finding creative ways to bring climate justice literacy, even into really what some might say socially conservative or resistant spaces, by using these tools of talking to students about how text is motivated, giving them a chance to think about that question, working with interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary colleagues so that the work is supported by scientific fact or other disciplines. Most recently, a student that I work with brought climate justice literacy into a Bible studies class and made that work for them. And that when we start to think about where we are, we can also think about how we're counter-narrating the kinds of policies and laws that we need to resist ourselves as teachers, and that is part of a climate justice literacy. And that's my spiel, Nick. I'm really glad to be in conversation, but I didn't want to, I was trying to be really short and I have no idea how much time that took, but thank you all.
Alex, that was magnificent. And it brought up a lot for me, and I'm sure others too. So I'll bring my notes to the discussion afterward. Thank you. Next, we're going to kick it over to Anja. Anja, take it away.
Okay. Hello, everybody. So now to a completely different perspective. So I'm looking at climate literacy in the classroom through engaging with children's literature and plants. So why plants? Why talk about plants when we actually want to talk about climate? So because, as I would argue, one of the big issues in climate justice and climate literacy is plant blindness. You probably all know that term, the human inability to take notice of plants. Normally, we just perceive plants as setting, don't perceive them at all. Famous childhood memory of mine is when I watched the Star Trek episode, Captain Kirk with my father, and they were on that planet with this tricorder in the middle of a plastic plant forest, and Spock said, "No life signs." And little Anja thought, does Spock know all the plants are plastic? So we don't take notice of plants. However, plants are vital for the climate, and so they are also vital for climate literacy. It's plants that they bind CO2, they regulate temperatures, especially in local climates. They counteract desertification, and they are also the first to be affected by climate change. We tend to forget that. We tend to think anthropocentrically about us. It's the plants that suffer first. So important in education is that we raise children's awareness of plants. Right now, we are so far away from that I would argue that it's a good thing if we manage to do 2 steps in the near future. First one is to raise awareness in children of the mere existence of plants, to just get them to take notice of plants being there. And the second thing is that we drive home that plants are living, breathing organisms, that they are agents in ecosystems and not just settings. So how do we do that if we are in English and American literary studies? I brought 2 examples here, 2 children's books that are both good points to start from. I think if we want to work with climate literacy through plants in a classroom, but they are good works, as I said, to start with, not good works to finish with, perhaps. So the first one is Kathleen Van Cleef's Drizzle from the US. Second one, Sophie Anderson's The Girl Who Speaks Bear from the UK. Both tell stories of human children, of plants, and of climate change. So very similar narratives. Drizzle tells of a girl and her friend, a rhubarb plant, who figure out how to make it rain again. The Girl Who Speaks Bear tells of a girl who is aided by a supernatural lime tree in restoring an ecosystem. However, both of these books present plants from a very anthropocentric perspective. So these are not brilliant teaching tools to climate literacy, but they are the best we have in a way. So they do not tell new stories, but basically very old stories in a new guise, ultimately of a girl discovering her identity. And they still present ecosystems as somewhat static or just kind of elastic. But if we just stop messing around with ecosystems, they'll simply snap back to a natural state and all will be well again. This is obviously an oversimplification. It's not going to be that easy, and that's not a narrative we want our children to learn. So there are some counterproductive undercurrents even in books that do deal with climate change and plants. So to mention some implications I think this has for the classroom. So first of all, I think that schools need to work a lot more with not only literature, but generally media children consume that somehow deal with plants, that show them they are there, they are important for ecosystems, they are important for the climate. And we need to raise awareness in teachers of kind of critically reading these books. So not only climate literacy, but also a form of literary and cultural studies literacy precedes climate literacy there, because we need to raise awareness of issues within these books. And ultimately, the big aim should then be to transmit this literacy. So not only the climate literacy, but also the literary and cultural studies literacy to the ultimate target group, to the children. So that the generation that actually needs this knowledge will be able to put their fingers on problematic narratives and come up with different narratives in the future. And this was me in a nutshell. This is what I'm working on. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Anja. And I'm reminded of what you were telling us before the webinar started about how y'all are getting some much needed rain for very thirsty plants. So I'm glad for that for you and those plants in Northern Germany. Thank you so much, Anja. Next up, we have Dr. Antonio Lopez. Dr. Lopez, take it away.
Okay, thanks. I'm excited because I'm learning so much and we're just getting started. And I've already seen connections between what I do with what others have presented so far. So I'm going to just give a very general overview of the kind of work that I've been doing. And I want to start with the concept of eco-media, which is a fairly new and emerging field of media studies, cultural studies, but it also combines many other types of disciplines, which is looking at media from essentially 2 different perspectives, from their material impacts and also their impacts on how we believe or engage and experience the world. So it's about media, it's recognizing that media are part of the environment and they are also about the environment. And I found that most media literacy that I was working in, most media literacy curriculum that had been developed at the time that I entered into the field, which was over 20 years ago, there was absolutely no awareness of any of this. And most people are unaware of the relationship between media and the environment. So this has been sort of my main task, is to educate the people in my field to see the relationship, and thankfully a lot more people are becoming aware of this. But let me just say very briefly what I mean by ecomedia, because I feel like there's still a gap in knowledge about what this is. So the way that I like to explain it is that there's an ecological footprint and an ecological mindprint of media. So the ecological footprint, which is the part that most people are familiar with, is mostly related to the production chain of our gadgets. So it starts with the extraction of minerals or energy from sacrifice zones, mostly in lower income regions of the world. For example, a lot of the rare earth minerals for our phones and computers come from Central Africa, but then lithium that we use for our batteries, for electric cars, but also for phones and tablets, etc., come from the Andes mostly. And in order for us, this economy is based on extractivism, which is a very highly unjust and polluting system of economics. And our media is very much embedded in that system. So other ways that our technologies are damaging to the environment is through e-waste. Also, the places where our gadgets are manufactured have a very high toxic impact. I was thinking about China and how a lot of the rivers are drying up. And I read that 50% of the water in China is not drinkable. And that's largely due to industrial pollution. And China manufactures, the majority of our technology that we use. So we may not be experiencing the direct environmental impacts of our technologies where we live, but they are impacting people in other parts of the world. And CO2 emissions of our data farms and servers, which also have a large water impact as well. Currently the data cloud produces as much CO2 as the airline industry. It'll go up as we increase the amount of information that we process online. So even if our phones, once we have them, we're not actually consuming that much energy, the data that we have to access on a daily basis is consuming a lot of energy. So that's a big issue. And just another quick note, just to say that we need to think more about the impact of technology on water. We don't think enough about how it impacts water. Water is used for servers to cool server farms, but also it gets polluted by e-waste and from mining and manufacturing practices, and also the impact on gender equality, because in all these zones that I'm talking about, women take inordinate amount of burden for the environmental destruction and violence that the system causes. And then the ecological mindprint is how media impact our beliefs about the environment, whether it's through popular culture, through literature, books, children's books, comic books, the news, and also how the environment or environmental policy is discussed and communicated through news media, through political communication. And one issue that I'm particularly concerned about is the problem of disinformation, particularly disinformation produced by the fossil fuel industry. So my goal is to try to take this awareness and integrate it into the way that we practice media literacy. And one obvious example could be in media, when you apply eco-media literacy, rather than just focus on fake news as a generic analysis of any news, focus on what I call fake climate news, and really pay attention to the way that climate disinformation and the way that different media systems are producing ignorance and misunderstanding about climate policy and about climate science. This could be a huge job, a huge task of eco-media literacy, which I feel like hasn't quite taken this on. And so through my work, try to push and to try to convince my colleagues to center ecological issues in the work that they do. And the last thing I'll say is I'm in the process of developing a website called ecomedialiteracy.org. You can access it now. It's a beta site. And we'll be setting up a forum in the very near future so that people can create lessons and share them with other people. So it'll be open education resource. There's also lots of research resources and links for people, for students and faculty or teachers to do, for places to research about the problems of ecomedia and also the solutions. So I'll just close by saying, I don't have a completely negative or cynical view of ecomedia. I think it's important for us to be aware that media will be part of the solution. So we wanted to encourage more positive ways that media are communicating about the environment, but also the way that media technologies are developed and how they impact the environment. So I encourage people to go to the ecomedialiteracy.org website and to contact me if they're interested in contributing their own lessons to the resource, which I hope will expand and grow in the coming year. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antonio. My notes are getting pretty messy and interconnected. There's a lot of things sparking for me, and I know there are for other folks too, which makes me realize how prescient the cover image of your book is, of the Delta. There's so many interconnections. I'm excited to dive into during our discussion. But next up, we have Dr. Tanya Nathaniel. Tanya, it's all yours.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself there. Hi, I'm happy to be here today and share a little bit of some of what I've been doing in my children's literature online course. One of the books that I teach is The Story of the Blue Planet by Andrew Magnusson. And this is a book from Iceland. It's in translation. And Andrew Magnusson, the author, is also a very active participant in, climate change, activism and making people aware, especially because, of course, in Iceland, they've got the glaciers and the glacier melt and so on that's been happening. And so he's, a really active participant in climate literacy as a whole. And his book reflects this. And so my argument here today, is that this is the perfect book to use to teach climate literacy. And what I love about it is that it has this really nice narrative arc towards climate consciousness. And so what I'd like to do here today is I'm going to tell you a little about the book. I'm going to kind of map out this, this arc towards climate consciousness or an ecotopia. And then I'll close with just some comments of what activities I've used in the classroom and how I've gotten my students to engage with the book. So first up, the book is the Story of the Blue Planet is a fantasy. It's told in a very fable-like style. It's a kind of a young adolescent book. It's a chapter book and it has lots of illustrations. So it's somewhere between a picture book and a chapter book. And it's probably for, ages 8, 10, but really it's one of those universal kind of stories that any age can enjoy. The book is, as I said, a fantasy set on a blue planet that is very similar to our world. It's kind of allegorical in that way, where this book, this blue planet is meant to represent our own Earth. But on this planet, it's inhabited by like the eternal children. They're called the wild children. And when we first meet the wild children, they are they're living the good life. They're living the utopia, but it's an unconscious life. They are not conscious of their own impact on the environment, even though their life is very good. They have enough to eat, they can sleep, play, do whatever. And as the narrative goes, the children were completely free to do what they pleased because there were no grown-ups on the planet to tell them what to do. So they ate what they liked, they did what they liked. And even as they're talking about how perfect and beautiful their life is, all of a sudden they'll like clunk a seal on the head and have it for lunch. And it's, it's a shocking sort of scene for most people to read that, but I think it's meant to draw to your attention their unconscious state, like that everything is plentiful and available to them. And there's, they're not conscious of their impact on the environment, even though their life is good. Now along comes a character called Jolly Good Day. Jolly Good Day comes along in his rocket. He's an adult. He's meant to represent consumer culture and capitalism. And he is he's like the villain of the piece. But he's a very subtle villain because he always acts like he's offering the children something that they want. And they say like, oh, our life is perfect, we're having fun. And he's like, well, let me show you what real fun is all about. And so he nails the sun to the sky and he steals the dust off the butterfly wings and he makes the children able to fly. And they're having such a wonderful time. But by doing all of these things, their planet starts to shift into a dystopia because they are monopolizing on the resources of their planet. And they don't realize that as they're doing this, the children on the other side of the planet have fallen into darkness and now they no longer have the things that they need. And they don't discover this. The main access characters, Brimmer and Hulda, they end up in this runaway balloon race and it ends up blowing them to the other side of the planet. And suddenly they discover that all is not right here, that they discover their impact. So we see this kind of like arc of understanding that it goes to this point where they realize that they have been harming their planet. They've been harming their world and they've been harming these children on the other side of the world. So they return to their own side of the planet and they have to confront now Jolly Good Day and the other children and convince them that that this is harmful and they need to give up their freedom to fly, which is very hard to convince the other children to do because that's a fun thing to do. And to unnail the sun from the sky so that that the other children can live. And I think one of the most important realizations of the book is they say, like, if the forest dies, we die too. And that's a very significant moment because when they're on the dark side of the planet, they notice that, like, well, once you take the sunshine away, the plants die, the animals die, like everything starts to fall apart. There's no food, there's no water, there's nothing for people to live on. So anyway, what's really interesting about this book too is that they don't banish Jolly Good Day, they don't kill him. They ask him what he wants. And he says, well, I've always wanted to be a king. And they were like, well, that's easy. Okay, you get to be a king. And so he's happy and they're happy. And there seems to be this kind of thematic resolution that somehow that we can, as long as we are conscious of our impact on the environment, that we can find a balance, like that we can find a balance with consumer culture. And, like everybody can have a part in this new ecotopia world. So that's that book in a nutshell, and kind of why I think it's wonderful. It just kind of takes us through this whole journey. And then what I ask my students to do is I want them to map that journey. And I ask them to pick 3 moments and, 3 significant moments in the text where the children learn something, and then make like an illustrated map to demonstrate like where did they make the, or learn this knowledge, and, what was the result and where were they when it happened. And what I've discovered is that the students are very tuned into the emotional impact, like the interpersonal relationships. And I've noticed a lack of like the lessons that they've pointed out, of the lessons learned. It's all about these interpersonal relationships and like learning to care for their friends and learning to care, for each other. And there's not as much of a realization themselves of like, well, what about the planet? Like what about the lessons about learning from the planet, like that our impact on the planet. So I think when I revise this lesson, I'm going to include more explicit instructions of like, okay, what's the impact on what are the lessons learned have to be realizations about the planet. So so that's still a work in progress. I'm still trying to like bring that lesson to the fore. But I think it's an excellent book to teach climate literacy, and I highly recommend it. And that's my presentation.
Thank you, Tanya. And I so appreciate the reflections you offered of teaching this book and discussing it with students. And I would love to debrief with you about that. And I'd love to hear how the second iteration goes. But thank you. Right, next up, we've got Yingyu Chen. Yingyu, it is all yours.
Thank you, Nick, and hello, everyone. My name is Yu. I am a language and outdoor educator for elementary school age children. I'm also a climate activist. Born in Taiwan and based in Massachusetts now, I offer bilingual courses to enhance children's awareness of culture from nature. But before we talk about climate literacy, many of you may agree that children are curious and they're eager to learn many cool fun facts about the world. For example, I know that there are many children know what animal has cubicle poops, or if polar bears do have a coat of white fur. But interestingly, even many know that stinky flowers are the biggest flower in the world, but they don't know what invasive plants are around their neighborhood and how they are actually interlinked with climate change. So for being trained as a community naturalist from Mass Audubon, I believe children are capable and powerful to do more than that. And they actually do care for many subtle things we adults sometimes ignore, but they need support and guidance. So today, I'd like to share a framework that I apply to make climate literacy work. The first is the use of text place-based education, the text about the place-based education. Before I apply my texts, I would like to talk about the different vehicles and industries around my students' towns and communities, so they can get a better sense of how human activities can influence the wildlife. So there are two different ways that I would instill them with a place-based education. The first is the books that offer background information. For example, the first book, Moth, an Evolution Story, is one of my favorite. And it actually shows how the moth changed its color due to human influence. Well, just the Industrial Revolution. So we will start from the change, and then we'll talk about how the trajectory, the path of the changes, and we will further talk about the climate change. Second, we would talk about some books or some specific topics, and then add up something as extended activities, so they can learn the environment and the relationship with the climate change. So for example, in one of my classes, we're talking about Yellowstone National Park. So I offer the students a worksheet about the American bison's migratory path, but actually we're also talking about how the path has changed over time due to climate change. So they will learn something that, well, it's not actually that far away from them. It's not just polar bears and about the carbon emission, but also something that they can really see, or they can really they hardly know actually if no one tells them. All right, so we'll move on to problem-solving skills. Some of you might have heard about a 7-year-old child who fundraised for mosquito nets to help children in Africa to fight against malaria. She is awesome, but I'd also like to say that people behind her are equally important because they instill and support her problem-solving skills. We, as climate literacy educators, were also important, just like those heroes with no capes. So here I would like to share with you two of the methods that we can apply climate literacy to tell and share with our students. The first is, of course, book club, or offer them the reading list so they can know more about the environment, and also like what we can do with the book and with our community or even with ourselves. The second is not just about reading, we're really doing something. For example, the book, the bottom in the middle, compost stew, is actually a really fun and starting point for people to have the awareness and action of waste reduction, because it is actually one of the solutions to climate change. And then the last, I would like to talk about texts that connects with conversation. Well, I believe most of you like watching movies. So do I, and I think many of the kids. So we can start not just from books, but also many different media. One of my favorite is to have students or children to watch documentaries with us. Well, they can watch with us or with their families individually, but then we can talk about something further. We can have conversation. And so in my experience, I have also invited people to talk further. For example, on this slide, we have a movie called Whale Island. So I actually invited one of the actors and also an international whale photographer to talk about his experience taking photos around the world of whales and dolphins and how things are changed over time. And the other thing is I've also asked students to watch about the Formosan black bear, and they're a specific type of bear in Taiwan. So I invited Taipei Zoo animal manager to talk with students, and they can ask questions and know further about how the environment changes and how people from the zoo's perspective can help with the world and help the animal. So what's next? I think apart from these three methods, we can connect with our local organizations such as National Audubon Society, Mothers Out Front, or natural history museums. And these are some of the pathways that we can go forward. So that will be my presentation, and I'd happy to answer questions afterwards. Thank you, Nick, and everyone.
Thank you, Yingyu. This is so rich. And I am really taken by how much of this is about relationships, both between young people and the natural world around them, but also between different organizations and educators. There's a lot of interconnection here. And as a former nature educator with kindergartners myself, I really appreciate the nod to children's fascination with poop. I do think that goes a long way. So thank you, Yingyu, for all the work that you do. And last up, we have Dr. Alan Webb. Alan, it's all yours.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for the presentations, and I'm enjoying connecting with you guys. Yingyu was talking about kids reading groups, and I run a reading group on climate change, interdisciplinary reading group. And if anybody wants to join, put your email in the chat or send me an email. I'm going to talk about intergenerational justice, which I think is a very important theme for our teaching and for our thinking about the climate crisis. And the slide starts off in the corner talking about justice, climate justice, interracial justice, because I think those are places where our teaching needs to focus. The intergenerational justice, comes out of this, we do not inherit the world from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. And I think that young people really resonate to understanding issues of intergenerational justice, and it positions them well to speak because they have a real right to expect and demand that they inherit a world that's livable for them. And so I think there are three main pieces of how to go about doing intergenerational justice teaching, and that's inquiry, justice, and action. And so when it comes to inquiry, I think we can invite our students to look into obviously what's happening with the climate crisis and what is going to be happening in the future, and how urgent it is that we address that, and what impacts it will have during their lifetime, which is now reaching out to the point where it's beyond even what the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, talks about 2100 all the time, but children in schools may live beyond that. I think it's another thing that we need to be looking into in school is how youth have been protesting the climate crisis, and youth have been involved in civil rights protests. From filling the buses in Birmingham to leaving middle schools and high schools during the Vietnam War over the Kent State Massacre, for example, and obviously Greta Thunberg and all the I think the world's largest climate action that was the Fridays for the Future event. And I think that kids need to learn about these things. And Greta's own writing, and there's a number of books about her and books about the climate movement. Those are many of them are picture books. Some of them are pretty simple to read chapter books. Those would also be good texts for classroom inquiry, I think. And they need to learn about organizations and groups that are doing things. From Fridays to the Future, Sunrise, and Zero Hour are three examples of youth-led climate action groups. And I think this is part of the inquiry that needs to be going on in every classroom, because this story is going to be affecting, obviously, their world and all the different starting points you guys have also suggested for doing that. This idea of intergenerational justice is one that's deeply embedded in almost all cultural and legal systems. In Europe, it goes back to Roman law, which established the idea of a public trust to protect resources for the next generation. And lawsuits have been initiated all over the world. One of the most important ones in the Philippines in the 1990s, but there's many of them. There'll be a link there to a website with all kinds of information about those lawsuits. For older students in junior high or even high school, they can read some of the text from these lawsuits and some of the judge decisions and so forth. Again, establishing the idea of a right to have a future that is not damaged by the previous generation. The United States, I think, is one of the only countries on earth that's not a signatory to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. But I think that convention is a very important starting point for children to be learning about their rights. And I think in the United States, it's a good topic to explore and try to figure out why is our country not supported this United Nations Convention, and then, of course, inquiry and justice should be combined with action. And so there's so many ways in which young people can be taking action in their classrooms, in their school buildings, in their communities, and beyond. One thing I talk about is public writing and ways in which they can make their own writing public. That can be they can write essays. Obviously, they can examine critically greenwashing that is going on. They can create their own counter narratives to greenwashing and do media busting and what do they used to call that, ad sort of reversing ads and things. And they can write poetry and they can write short stories addressing the climate crisis and their own feelings about it and what's happening. And they can find podiums to share this, whether it's physically or online. I think that kids should be invited to create local environmental clubs in their school. They should have my daughter, when she was just a couple years ago in the 5th grade, created a climate club in her school, and it got a lot of attention and drew a lot of kids in. They brought speakers in, they did artwork, they made a website, posted some of their writing, and it became an important opportunity for her and for the school to begin to learn about how they can take action and what kinds of ways in which they can take action. And those of us who teach in language arts related fields, we're so well positioned for helping students learn to get their voice and have their voices heard and so forth. And students can also, go to their school and say, we need to, as a school, to declare a climate emergency and try to figure out how they can get their school to sign on to that, or the school boards, or go to their local communities and set up climate action plans, petition cities and townships and local areas to have to declare the climate emergency. And I think that that's an important part of getting started is recognizing the urgency that faces us, and the degree of the crisis that faces us, and where we're going. And I kind of disagree politely with people who are reluctant to put forward the seriousness of this problem to young people for fear that it will overwhelm them. And I don't want to overwhelm children. But on the other hand, this is the world, this is the reality, this is the truth. And I think it's very important that we tell the truth. And it's very important that young people have a chance to, through their own process of inquiry, not to be lectured at, but to learn about the truth themselves and to share what they're learning with each other and with their community. And I think that it's happening so fast with so much power, with so many local implications and global implications, that it's vital that young people start understanding it and acting on it. I have a couple of quotes there on the bottom from Antonio Gutierrez, the Secretary General of the United Nations, about how the older generation has failed to address adequately the climate crisis, and from Varishni Prakash, who's the co-founder of Sunrise, about how there isn't time to wait. I mean, the idea that young people should grow up and become climate scientists, as Greta Thunberg says in her most famous TED Talk, which is one that I think that all kids should see that more than once, even. That we know the answers in many ways. We're just not acting on it. We're just not doing enough about it. And there's not time to wait for kids to become adults, to become climate scientists, or to start voting and changing things. We need to be addressing things now. If we're going to cut greenhouse gases by 50% by 2030, that leaves us 7 some years to do that. And that has to happen if we're going to have any hope of staying anywhere near 2 degrees Celsius of global warming. And we're the dangers of one of the world's most famous climate scientists has said that the difference between 2 degrees and 4 degrees of global warming is human civilization. And the IPCC says even 6 degrees is possible in the lifetime of children today, and 4 degrees is very likely at business as usual. And we haven't really reduced our greenhouse gas emissions, so we've got to be utilizing everything we can to help young people's voice be heard. So that's basically my my little contribution.
Thank you, Alan. And of the many things this made me think about, it reminded me how diligent I need to be in being aware of my own adultist biases, and imagining that adults are the sole arbiters of knowledge and direction in politics, but that young people have a lot to teach us. And in fact, following the quote at the top of this slide, should be the focus of all of our activities. And that is a beautiful transition to a more multivocal discussion. I have a ton of questions for y'all, and you don't even want to look at my notes because it is a scribbled mess. And we have lost Alex. Alex was facing some storms today, so her internet's coming in and out. So if she comes back, we'll welcome her. But folks in attendance, feel free to pop questions in the Q&A as we get into this in the next 10 minutes. But in lieu of me asking questions, because so much has been brought up, I want to invite the 5 panelists to offer questions or connections or realizations to one another. What came up for y'all during this? What feels relevant or burning to you after hearing from others?
I thought hearing about plant blindness was really insightful because I never heard the term before, but I have an exercise that's kind of connected to that, which is I went around my neighborhood and I took pictures of different trees, and I have a slide with 6 different trees. And then I asked the students if they know the names of these trees, and usually they don't. Maybe they'll know maybe one. And then I have a slide. The next slide is the alphabet of corporate brands. You can find it very easily on the internet. A, B, C, D, each letter from a corporate brand. And the students can identify all of those. And so then we have a discussion of like, well, why is it that you know all the names of these brands, but you don't know the names of the trees in your neighborhood. And what is the significance of that? And how does that impact the way that we live our lives, et cetera? And it's actually the first warm-up exercise I do in the semester. And I just think it's interesting that how this concept of plant blindness really ties into that. So we need that term. Oh, and I'll add one other thing. I gave a talk to a group of Italian students, and I talked about how weeds are a cultural construct. And I just said it as a passing comment, because I have a slide of pesticide advertisements where we talk about, the way that plants are constructed in visual media. But that stood out for some students as the most important insight that led to a bunch of other insights. Just this one idea that a weed is a cultural construct.
Yeah, I was really taken by the plant blindness presentation of Anja's as well. And it put me in mind of, I don't know if you've heard of Robert Macfarlane. He's a scholar and poet in Scotland. And he's written 2 books of poetry called The Lost Words and The Lost Spells. And they got funding from the government or something to put these books in all of the elementary schools in I don't know if it was just in Scotland or in the entirety of the UK, but his argument is that we are losing words. Like the younger generation, going off of what Antonio said, they don't know the names for plants. They don't know the names of trees. They don't know the names of many animals. And so what his poetry highlights is like it brings these words and these names kind of back into the vernacular, into the vocabulary, and it gives them to children in these fun and beautiful poems. And so anyway, that's more literature to share in the classroom, because those are really beautiful books. And I just love I love the concept. I don't love that it's happening, of course, but I love the concept of lost words, like that we need to somehow, save these words from being lost.
One of the things that people in Extinction Rebellion have done, and of course it's associated with civil disobedience, but they do a lot of very interesting creative protests, is they've put up all kinds of signs on trees with the tree speaking its own, presumably speaking like, I'm converting CO2 to oxygen, or I'm, sequestering carbon to protect the environment, or are you protecting me, and one thing kids could do is they could create up all kinds of, statements about what, in some sense, the tree or other plants might be saying to us about their impact of what's happening with, the global extinction or the climate crisis. And that would give students a way to, both stop being blind to plants, start doing creative protests that would grab people's attention. They could do it in their own backyard, basically, or on the street, or in front of their school, or in their community. They could organize other people to do it. They could think a lot about what kind of things they would want the plants to be saying. And so I think that there's so many ways that we can take these critical problems, such as a lack of awareness of what's happening to plants and not paying attention to them, and work on it, turn it into a way to educate others about the urgency of the crisis.
I think this also very closely interconnects to the eco-media literacy Antonio was talking about, because when I'm researching plant blindness, I find that a lot of it also happens in the media. So just yesterday, I read another article about was a closed road in Germany. Apparently, it's a terrible thing. They have to take, what is it, like a detour of 4 kilometers. That's what I drive on my bike to work every morning. So huge detour. There's another road. And they presented that as a battle of humans against the bat colony living there. But I mean, there's an entire forest around that. And I don't know how many hundreds or even thousands of different plant species. And this is often just ignored in the media. So whenever there's any kind of, not only climate, but any kind of environmental narrative, it's generally framed as humans versus animals. And so I was very taken by Antonio's presentation about eco-media literacy, because I think this is the kind of tool we would need to battle this plant blindness. I think is very tricky to cope with, because it's so overwhelming and everywhere. So thanks for giving that term to me, Antonio. I took a note of your book.
So I think one of the things we can do is we can figure out how not only to think critically about the media and its representations, but how to strategically utilize the media in order to do things. I mean, the example I gave students could be taking pictures of it and putting it on their social media, or they could be have a press conference and dressed as trees or something like that, you know, or all the different kinds of ad busting and media, you know, media revealing strategies people can use.
I also like that, Alan, you mentioned your child has a climate club, right?
Yes.
I'm also very taken away by that, because they are actually activists. They're doing it. So thank you, and your daughter and their classmates. And also, I would like to say something about the plant blindness from Anja as well. That is something that I have learned from many other naturalists. They say that children, they're so they're curious about the animals, because you can see they move, but all the plants, they're really vulnerable. And especially during this climate change and all the crisis, the invasive plants, they're coming and hovering. So actually, like from New England, where I live, there are so many different invasive plants from warmer places, and they're coming up north. So yeah, it's kind of something that people hardly are aware of, but we should start doing that. Yeah. So thank you.
In the spirit of spreading the word and raising awareness, I want to read the question from Colleen in the Q&A, and maybe this will be a good way to conclude the webinar, because it's the spirit of the question, I think, is forward-looking and it's activist in its orientation. So this is posed to everyone. Colleen asks and writes, I would love any thoughts from the panel on motivating youth to share their climate stories. She's currently working with the city of La Crosse, Wisconsin, and youth and public climate engagement as part of the city's climate action plan. One element of this project is a storytelling initiative through words and art. However, they have yet to have many submissions. If anyone has any ideas to encourage public and youth in general to feel safe to share their stories, it would be greatly appreciated. Final thoughts on motivating story sharing.
I don't have a specific formula for this, but I would like to mention and plug 350.org has a whole web section on digital storytelling. And it has a whole methodology for there's different approaches to develop digital stories. And I highly recommend you to take a look at that, because there might be a methodology there that you could apply. And I would just say that I've been teaching writing for advocacy, the climate crisis, using Juliet Corbett's climate communication book as a basis, which is really good. And one of the things she says, sort of repeats over and over again, is the importance of just starting a conversation. So that, I think it sounds very simple and basic, but I think people, through this sort of spiral of silence and fear of engaging something that's controversial, or fear of, confronting the difficulties of the problem, is they just don't want to talk about it. So to invite people to start a conversation, the conversation doesn't necessarily have to have a specific goal, but it's just to raise the issue of the climate into the general discourse, because it's been completely silenced. And that is a way to sort of open up for other conversations. So I would make that recommendation.
Students might think about, teachers are trying to recruit student voices, might think about some of the, we like long stories, we like big essays, but there's flash fiction, which can be just a paragraph long sometimes. There's specific images that, I love this idea of digital storytelling that Antonio is talking about. And I think that a range of different ways in which their stories can be told. And sometimes if a few that can inspire people, make more things happen. So sharing the kind of work with kids that other kids are doing can really be helpful.
Yeah, that was my thought as well. I think that stories beget stories, and I think people need to hear stories before they can start telling their own. And I think that's especially true with kids. I think there might be some reticence because they don't know what they want to say about the climate crisis, and maybe it's just all too big. But if you can find something that they can relate to on their level, like maybe just pick a smaller theme, like, well, what's your relationship with water, or what do you think the trees in your neighborhood are doing, or the things that we've been talking about here generally as well. Starting with little inspiring questions, like taking a small piece, breaking it down, because climate is a big territory and it's a little bit overwhelming. But I think if you can break it into smaller pieces, they might find they have something to say about, like, do they like clean water? They like to have clean water. Do they want to see that they're, that the animals in the neighborhood are surviving a heat wave, or something like that. And they can, then their empathy is engaged, and then they have something more to say.
It's also one of the other pieces of advice is to localize as much as possible, to tie the climate story to your personal experience. So if someone likes sports, how is climate change affecting sports? Or if they like ice cream, how does it affect ice cream? I mean, you try to get it really specific so they can sort of tell the story through that specific thing that they really love.
Which also I think is really helpful is to have them kind of practice the story in a safe environment. So I know that our university has this podcast lab that our students can use. I don't know if that would be open to schools as well, but they can go in, like, play around with the technology, come up with their own podcast on some small topic. And at one point, at least, I know that they also published some of their student podcasts on the local newspaper website, only if the students wanted, of course. So it's like you can play around, do your podcast, and if you feel really confident your podcast was well received by other students, then perhaps the local newspaper might publish it on their website. So that might be kind of a fail-safe system where you can draw back at every step saying, okay, I don't want my story to be published that far to that wide an audience, or I want it to be outside there in the world at large.
I would also like to add up to some fun. So people might want to have some scavenger hunts. You might have a list or something, or make it visually pleasing, so they would like to engage more. And also they can also add it up to their social media if they want to. They can feel comfortable adding that, just like Anja said, and also what Tanya just mentioned. So that would be fun, and people would like to get more committed to doing that as well.
I have a lot that I want to do following this. Thank you again to the panelists and folks in attendance and folks who will be watching this in the future. It's striking to me that so much of what was said today is about beginning and sustaining a conversation, and that involves relationships, and that involves community. And it's been an honor to be in community and in conversation with you all today. So thank you again. If you would like more Climate Lit events, you can visit our website, climatelit.org, look at the events. Our next event is in 3 weeks, September 20-something on a Friday, with Dr. Grace Dillon about Indigenous futurisms, young adult literature, and climate literacy. So thank you again, everyone, and enjoy your weekend. Take care, everyone.